My name is Bob Pollack. I am a professor of biological sciences, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion, which is sponsoring this presentation by Ken Edelin. I hope you will have signed up outside. I know you're here by an email registration, but we'd like to have a confirmation of your presence and make sure you're on our mailing list. There are two novelties to tonight's talk, so before I introduce Ken, I have to recognize those two novelties. The first is that because of the number of people and the topic at hand, we're trying out a new way to do questions at the end. We've handed out white cards. If you haven't gotten any, raise your hand and we'll make sure somebody gets you a card. Make your questions during the talk, and then we'll collect them and I'll give them to Ken as questions one at a time so he can compose his answer from one to the next. That's the first novelty. The second is that at current count there are 6 people here, myself included, from the class of 1961 Columbia College. Ken's one, I'm another. I see Marty Kaplan, Stan Futterman, I see Leo Swergold and Joe Rosenstein, and there may be others. This is the 50th anniversary of our arrival at Columbia. And it has always stunned me when I realized that when we were here in 1957, if we had met someone from the class of 1911, we would say it's not possible. But here we are, and it is possible. And so in that context, it's a novel honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Ken Edelin, who went from Columbia College to medical school, Meharry, I think, if I got it right. From there to a career in obstetrics, which is full of honor, accomplishment, political effectiveness, at some personal risk to himself. He is, in these 50 years, a model of a way to live that I think, if I may grab a phrase or two from the current newspapers, gives one hope for change in this country in the direction of racial and class equity in the delivery of medical care. So he is an emeritus professor today of obstetrics and gynecology, and he was from '89 to 2006 the associate dean for student and minority affairs at the BU School of Medicine, and from '94 to 2006 the director of the early medical school selection program at BU School of Medicine. He was as well the chairman of the Department of OBGYN at BU Medical School, and director of OBGYN at Boston City Hospital, where the talk he will give will be located, I think. He is, and this to me is the most important thing to say, he was 10 years ago, from '96 to '98, the managing director of Roxbury Comprehensive Community Health Center, then and now the largest provider of primary health care services in Boston's African American community. He was appointed to a position on the Public Health Commission of the City of Boston in '96, and his term ended in '98. Ken is, in other words, the kind of doctor who is available to his patients and available in acts of preventive medicine and acts of compassion which are now and then not welcomed by established society. So he is first and foremost a doctor for his patients above all other considerations. It's a great honor to share membership in the class of '61 with him, and without further ado, Ken Edelin.
Thank you very much. It was this summer when I got an invitation from Dr. Pollack to come here this evening. And this is a very special day indeed. It is the 35th anniversary of the landmark ruling by our United States Supreme Court in Roe v. Wade. So it's a very special day indeed, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the members of the class of 1961 for being here. Really, it's very special. I know we have some time constraints, so I will try to stay on schedule. Yeah. When I was a kid, my father used to drag me off to church on Sundays. Why, I don't know, but he did. Since this is the Center for the Study of Science and Religion, let me start off with a religious story. And every Sunday, without fail, the minister would take off his watch and put it up on the pulpit and look down at it and then talk for hours, it seemed. I was just a little kid. And every Sunday he would do the same thing. He would take off his watch, put it on the pulpit, and then talk for hours. And I, you know, like a kid, I would fidget and all that kind of stuff. And finally one Sunday, as the minister took off his watch and put it up on the pulpit, I leaned over to my father and said, "Daddy, what does that mean?" And my father, in a very loud stage voice, said, "Not a damn thing." So here we are. I'll try to keep to a schedule. Let me, you heard a little bit about my background. Let me tell you a bit more about myself. And I'd like to do that by reading from my book, Broken Justice. For some of you in the room, it will sound very familiar, and you will be able to relate and connect. For others in the room, you will sometimes listen in puzzlement, but I hope at the end you will be able to connect with some of the things that I talk about here in my life. Chapter 1, verse 20, no, I'm sorry, wrong book, excuse me. Chapter 1, The Road to Boston. I was born at the beginning of World War II, lived through the decade of the 40s with blackouts, air raid drills, ration books, segregated schools, gangs, the end of that hot war, and the beginning of the cold one, with duck and cover drills in school in case of a nuclear attack. For as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a doctor. The fire was kindled early on. As a skinny, bushy-headed, light-skinned colored kid growing up in Washington, D.C., I spent a lot of time in clinics and hospitals being poked, prodded, observed, and treated for various fevers, headaches, and stomach pains. I spent a lot of time in doctors' offices and was in awe of what they did. I found myself studying the carcasses of birds shot out of their nests by neighborhood kids with BB guns. I tried to save the life of an alley cat that had been hit by a car. I tended to a chicken with a broken neck during the one summer I spent on a farm. I was fascinated by living and dying beings, human and animal alike, and how their mysterious bodies worked. I wanted to know more. When I was 12, I watched my mother suffer and slowly die of breast cancer. I witnessed the failure of science, medicine, and prayer as her body withered away to nothing. She was only 46. Through the loneliness of being a motherless child, shuttled from relative to relative through the turmoil of adolescence and rebellion, I became all the more determined to be a doctor, a woman's doctor, to save lives and perhaps spare some other woman's son the anguish I had to go through. I was saved from the dangers of the streets of segregated Washington when I was transplanted to the hills of the Berkshires and the campus of the Stockbridge School, a radically left-leaning, progressive, co-ed, integrated boarding school that gave me a full scholarship. There, I found stability and sanity. There, I lost the stutter which had plagued me since my mother's death. At Stockbridge, I regained my voice and my life. I lived the magical decade at the beginning of the 60s at Columbia College in New York City, where there were coffee houses, guitar playing, poetry reading, Washington Square, free love, and legal drinking at age 18. It was the dawning of the age of Aquarius, lit by the dim light of freedom and possibilities. But the war in Vietnam threatened the early light and stirred many young people in white middle-class America to take to the streets to protest its dimming and damning of their future. In Black America, we were determined to shake this country of its racist roots, slavery, Jim Crow, and discrimination, and we would do it by any means necessary. The revolution we were a part of was being written by the alphabet of SNCC, NAACP, CORE, and SCLC. There were demonstrations everywhere as the newest American revolutionaries, black and white, felt more power each time they took to the streets. Picket lines were replacing picket fences as the American icon. The 60s was the decade of the Beatles, Motown, segregation, integration, joints, Vietnam, Cambodia, Selma, communism, the pill, free love, freedom, liberalism, the war on poverty, the Black Panthers, marches, hair, radicals, riots, rights, left, sex, the Cold War, Johnson, Nixon, burn, baby, burn, assassinations, and up against the wall, motherfucker. We lost Kennedy, X, Evers, King, another Kennedy, and our innocence. The 60s gave us the civil rights and sexual revolutions. They started with bus rides for freedom and ended with rocket rides to the moon. In the second half of that incredible decade, I officially became a doctor and a medical officer in the United States Air Force, spreading the freedom that America denied to me. A young black man shaped by the 60s, I rode my dream into the 70s as my generation tried to hold on to the gains that had been won in the streets, courtrooms, classrooms, and bedrooms. The Supreme Court seemed to be on the side of integration and freedom, but the government continued to lock up protesters. Women, mainly white women, having had their bodies and lives partially liberated by the pill, relearned the tactics and methods used by their foremothers who had marched for the right to vote and the right to birth control. They also learned from the civil rights and anti-war movements, confronting their oppressors and demanding more liberty and freedom. One of the leaders of this new women's movement, Betty Friedan, called on all American women to celebrate the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage by striking for free child care and abortion on request. Abortion. That shadowy part of American life was lobbed into the public arena, and the reverberations spread out across this country. Hawaii felt the tremors and was one of the first in the country to enact a liberal abortion law. Women marched and other states followed. The American Medical Association came out in favor of legal abortion by stating that it was a decision between a woman and her doctor, while the Vatican and its American bishops said that abortion was always homicide, even when the woman's life was in danger. In the United States Senate, Bob Packwood introduced a national abortion rights bill, and the U.S. Supreme Court finally agreed to hear 2 abortion cases, which would change the entire country and my life. So in 1971, I arrived in Boston, Massachusetts, determined to fulfill that dream and goal of becoming a woman's doctor, an obstetrician gynecologist. It was my goal. It had always been my dream ever since I was a little boy, but even more so once I had gotten to medical school. I knew when I arrived at Boston City Hospital and when I became an obstetrician gynecologist that I wanted to be able to provide the full spectrum of reproductive health care for my patients, for those women who were pregnant and who were happy about being pregnant, who rejoiced in their pregnancy. I wanted to be able to provide them with quality prenatal care so that at the end of that 9 months, both she and her baby would be healthy. For those women who were having difficulty conceiving, I wanted to be able to help them to fulfill their dreams of being able to get pregnant and having a child. I also was determined to provide abortion services for my patients. It was something I felt very strongly about, and that was a part of the full spectrum of reproductive health care services that I wanted to have my patients have access to. Boston City Hospital was the only municipal hospital in the city of Boston. It took care of those women in Boston. How are you? I'm great now. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to pause to recognize and ask you to welcome Dr. Alan Rosenfield, who is the Dean of the Malman School of Public Health here at Columbia, one of the great physicians of our time, has probably as an individual done more for women's health and women's reproductive health throughout this world than any one human being. Alan Rosenfield, thank you very much for being here. Boston City Hospital was the place where poor women, black women, Hispanic women would come for their health care. When these patients showed up at other institutions or at other doctors' offices without insurance, without Medicaid, the cry was always, send them to City Hospital. And that's where I wanted to be. These are the women that I wanted to take care of. This was my commitment, and I thought my contribution to the revolution that was taking place around me, both for civil rights and reproductive rights. We could provide abortions for our patients who came to Boston City Hospital if the patients met certain conditions. There was the infamous Abortion and Sterilization Committee, which had to approve every request by every woman who came to Boston City Hospital for pregnancy termination. And they would approve the request if continuation of the pregnancy could be demonstrated to be detrimental to the woman's physical health, so that if she had cardiac disease or kidney disease or liver disease or some other severe problem, and if continuation of the pregnancy would jeopardize her health or her life, she could come to the hospital. We as the residents would have to gather the consultations from her specialist doctors. We then had to write up the case with the consultants and present her case to the Abortion and Sterilization Committee, and they, 3 physicians, 3 male physicians, because most doctors at the time were men, would approve her petition. Sometimes the process was so cumbersome and so full of barriers and hurdles that a pregnancy that started in the first trimester up to 12 or 13 weeks pregnant, when she first came into the hospital requesting the termination, would have progressed into the second trimester. So that what technically was an easy procedure for someone in the first trimester would have progressed into the second trimester, where the procedure was somewhat more hazardous for the health of the woman. But we did it. We tried to provide the services in the best way we could. There were only a few of us residents who were willing to put ourselves in that position to provide the services, because abortions had to be done at the end of the day in the operating room after the regular schedule of surgeries had taken place. And it had to be performed with not only us as volunteers, but a volunteer group of nurses and anesthesiologists and scrub techs and operating room techs. And sometimes, because the schedule was so full, we would perform the procedures on Saturday mornings, again with a volunteer staff. The other way in which women could have access to therapeutic abortions at Boston City Hospital, and this was not only true in Boston at Boston City Hospital, but in many places throughout the country, was if the pregnancy, if it continued, could be demonstrated to be detrimental to her mental health. So again, the same procedure had to be carried out. We would find a psychiatrist who would see the patient, examine her, do the appropriate psychological, psychiatric test, write up a consultation that said continuation of the pregnancy would be detrimental to her mental health. This too was cumbersome and would take some time. And again, the case had to be presented to the Abortion and Sterilization Committee. They would approve it, and the woman could have her procedure carried out. So women, back in that time when I first got to Boston City Hospital, could in fact, and did in fact, have had access to abortion services at Boston City Hospital, but they had to be shown to be either seriously ill and on the verge of death, or crazy. The other part of the committee's charge, and the name suggests, is that they had to approve sterilization procedures for women. So that if a woman wanted to be permanently surgically sterilized, have her tubes tied, her case also had to be presented to the Abortion and Sterilization Committee, and they would again rule on her case and either grant her request or not to be permanently surgically sterilized. But the woman had to meet 3 criteria. Number 1, she had to be married. Number 2, she had to have at least 2 children. And number 3, she had to have her husband's permission. That's what life was like for women prior to Roe. And on January 22nd, 1973, the Supreme Court, 35 years ago, handed down this historic decision in Roe v. Wade, which wiped out every restrictive abortion law in America. Quite simply, it said that a woman had a right to terminate a pregnancy during the first trimester of that pregnancy. And that decision was between her and her physician. In the second trimester, 13 or 14 weeks up to the point of viability, 26, 27, 28 weeks, a woman still had a right to terminate her pregnancy, but the state could intervene for the first time to determine where the procedure could be carried out in consideration of the health of the woman. Because it was a more complicated procedure in the second trimester, the state could do something on behalf of women's health to say where the best place and the safest place would be for her to have the procedure. And in the third trimester, it said that a woman still had a right to terminate her pregnancy. But the state could intervene for the first time on behalf of the fetus and the potential for life. But a woman still had the constitutional right to terminate her pregnancy. It was as if something had blown open the doors and the windows of Boston City Hospital. Women from the poorest neighborhoods of Boston flooded our hospital. I don't know where they had gone prior to Roe. Some of them were able to scrape together the few dollars that they could get to take a bus to New York State, which had liberalized its abortion laws in the late 60s, and they would be able to scrape together enough money to pay for it. Some women self-induced, some women found illegal abortion providers, but suddenly with Roe v. Wade, it was legal, and they could come to Boston City Hospital. We were flooded. And there were only 2 of us by this time who were willing to provide abortions because residents, mainly residents in surgical specialties, are interested in doing procedures that will enhance their surgical skills. And after you do 1 D&C or 10 D&Cs, how much is there more to learn? So there were 2 of us who were willing to continue to provide abortion services. We tried to get the hospital administration. I had the gall and gumption to write them a letter to say, we need to do this in a better, more coherent and comprehensive way. We need to have a system. We need to have a staff dedicated to this. And they turned me down. So we struggled to provide the services. Not only did we provide first trimester abortions, but we provided second trimester abortions by opening up a saline abortion unit at Boston City Hospital. It was remarkable. We could take care of 3 patients a week. We had 24-hour nursing who stayed with the patients during their procedure. And it was the goal of the nurses to help make sure that the patients never had to come back again. They talked to them about contraception. They talked to them about the procedure that they were about to undergo. And they talked to them about sexuality education and the relationship between men and women and how they had to have dignity and how they had to have pride in their bodies and their autonomy. At the end of September of 1973, a young 17-year-old girl was a senior in high school, and her mother came to Boston City Hospital. She was pregnant. According to her last menstrual period, she was about 17 weeks pregnant. She was seen by one of my attending physicians, and he judged her to be 19 or 20 weeks pregnant. She was a senior in high school, and she was going to be the first person in her family to go to college. And she and her mother came to Boston City Hospital asking for help so that she could fulfill her dream and her family's dream for her. The attending physician called me in, introduced me to this young girl and her mother, because I would be taking care of her when she came into the hospital. And although I was used to, with great difficulty, seeing the desperation that many women felt who came in for abortions, there was something different about her. It was more than desperation in her voice and in her mother's voice, and it was more than depression in their voice, and in her eyes, I also thought I saw fear. And during my time when I got to know her and interview both her and her mother, I found out that they were keeping this pregnancy a secret from her father. He was known to be a violent man, and they were afraid that at the very least he would throw her out of the house, but they were also afraid that he might do her physical harm. So they conspired to keep the pregnancy and certainly the abortion from her father. At the beginning of October, on October 3rd, I attempted to do a saline infusion. It was unsuccessful. I had tried numerous times. It was unsuccessful. One of my attending physicians tried numerous times. It was unsuccessful. And at the end of the last try, he said to me, "Ken, I can't do it. You can't do it. The only way that we can terminate her pregnancy, that you can terminate her pregnancy, is by performing a hysterotomy. It's a major surgical procedure. An incision is made into the abdomen and into the uterus, and the products of conception, the fetus, the membranes, the placenta are removed. The incisions are closed." That's what happened. And she went home 3 days later. In December of 1973, the district attorney of Suffolk County subpoenaed the private medical records of 88 women who had come to Boston City Hospital for second trimester abortions. I was asked by the hospital administration to come review the records to make sure there was nothing in the records that would harm or embarrass the hospital. I did, found nothing in them, and the records went down to the district attorney's office. In February of 1974, I received a subpoena from the district attorney, as did all of the other interns and residents and the attending physicians, to come down to testify in front of the grand jury of Suffolk County. I called a friend of mine who was an attorney who was doing some other work for me and said, "What should I do?" I explained to him the circumstances of the patients that I had taken care of during my time at Boston City Hospital. I refreshed his memory about Roe v. Wade. He said, "Ken, as far as I can tell, there's nothing for you to worry about. Roe v. Wade has struck down every restrictive abortion law in Boston and in Massachusetts. What you did was perfectly legal, and what you did was in accordance with hospital policy. You have nothing to be afraid of. Go testify, and testify openly." I went down to the grand jury hearing room. As I walked into the room and was told to take a seat, there were two men seated behind a table, one with a very garish, flowery tie. To my right were the grand jurors. The man in the flowery tie, who I later found out was named Newman Flanagan, brought one of the medical records to me as I sat in the chair and said, "Do you know this patient?" I looked down at it, and in fact was the 17-year-old girl that I had taken care of in October. I said, "Yes, I know her." He said, did you perform an abortion on her?" I said, "Yes, I did." "And why did you?" "Because she and her mother asked me to." And in the record were the informed consent signed by both the young girl and her mother. Thank you very much. Any questions from the grand jury? A woman raised her hand and said, "Did you present her case to the Abortion and Sterilization Committee?" I said, "We don't have to do that anymore since Roe v. Wade. Thank you very much." As I got up to leave and walked out of the grand jury hearing room, the other man who was seated behind the table, Joe Mulligan, put his hand on my shoulder, and I turned around to see who it was, and there he was, a little bit taller than me. He said, "Doctor, you're not allowed to discuss your testimony here with anyone. This is a secret hearing. You can talk to your lawyer about it, and if you don't have a lawyer, I advise you to get one and get one soon." A troubling admonishment, a frightening admonishment, but it didn't make sense. I knew what I had done. I knew that I had stayed within the law. I knew that I had stayed within hospital policy. I knew I had only operated within my own guidelines, and I knew that the procedure I had carried out was legal and safe and appropriate medical care. I knew all of that. So I could not believe that this was going to go any further. In April of 1974, some 3 short months prior to the time when I was to finish my residency training and become the specialist in obstetrics and gynecology that I always wanted to be, I was having a meeting with a psychiatrist on our staff about fetal alcohol syndrome. If you remember, those of you who can remember those days, there was a great deal of interest in alcohol consumption. This was all brand new, and fetal abnormalities and retardation that occurred in the offspring of women who had consumed large amounts of alcohol. And he was afraid that we were missing alcohol consumption amongst our pregnant patients. And so we were having a meeting to try and figure out how we were going to discover this problem. And he had developed a 5-question questionnaire that he felt would identify such women at risks. And we struck a deal that he would be able to use this questionnaire if in return he gave us counselors for our patients who we discovered were drinking heavily. At the conclusion of that meeting, which occurred during the lunch hour, one of the nurses stuck her head in the door and said, "Ken, the district attorney's on the phone and he would like to talk with you." I said, "Phew, it's finally going to be over." Went to the phone and picked it up. "Doctor," he said in his South Boston Irish brogue, "this is Newman Flanagan. And I'm calling you to tell you that the grand jury has indicted you for manslaughter." Now, I'm calling you now before you hear it on the news tonight. I'm also telling you that I'm not sending the police around to arrest you because of your position at the hospital. I don't know whether I slammed the phone down. I don't know whether I dropped the phone on the floor. I don't know whether I put it down gently. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I remember, I was sitting in my apartment, which was across the street from the hospital, devastated. Why me? I faced 20 years in jail, loss of my medical license, not being able to finish my residency training program. The hospital immediately suspended me from my training program. Why me? I had been brought up in a family in Washington, D.C., where We always waited at the corner for the light to turn green because to walk on the red light was illegal. We were always admonished never to drop trash on the street because that was wrong. We were taught from early on never to do anything that would bring shame or embarrassment to the name. And we were always told, as I was growing up, that we had to be a credit to the race. And there I was, indicted for manslaughter. I called my sister. After we cried for a while, she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to go see my lawyer tomorrow and figure out what's next." I did. The phone was ringing off the hook. By this time, it was all over television and radio. It was in the evening newspapers. Chief resident in Obstetrics and Gynecology at Boston City Hospital indicted for manslaughter. There were 3 other people indicted as well. 3 of the faculty members of the attending physicians. 1 from the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology and 2 from the Department of Medicine and Infectious Diseases. And they were indicted on an 18th century statute against grave robbing because they had done some research that involved taking a fetus from the operating room after an abortion to the pathology lab, and that was the illegal dissection and transport of a human body. I went to see my attorney the next day and had sheets of papers of notes that people had, that I had taken as a result of the phone calls and suggestions of attorneys. And he and I went through the list, and he was from a very large, prestigious law firm in Boston, and he thought he could handle the case. But one of the names on the list was an attorney by the name of William Homans, who was a very prominent libertarian attorney from a very prominent Boston Yankee family. His cousin had been the governor of Massachusetts. His mother was an activist way back at the beginning of the 20th century, trying to get birth control legalized for women in Massachusetts. And so I hired him to be my attorney, and at the same time, a group of citizens came together from all over the country, mainly from Boston, but from every part of this country, to form something known as the Kenneth Edelin Defense Fund. I hadn't even thought about how I was going to pay for this. It didn't even occur to me that I would have to pay for this. But they knew, and they wanted to help me raise funds to pay for what were surely be an enormous legal bill. They also helped me line up speaking engagements so that I could go out and talk to people. I couldn't talk about the specifics of the case, but I could talk about reproductive rights and the Supreme Court ruling in general. And at the end of every talk, we would pass the hat. Someone in the audience would pass the hat to collect money for the Kenneth Edelin Defense Fund. The other thing that happened is that the news of the indictment traveled throughout the country, and it had several effects. Number one, it had the intended effect for the district attorney of intimidating other physicians. Physicians not only in Boston, but throughout the country, and hospitals throughout the country began to curtail the abortion services that they offered patients. They began to reduce the gestational age at which they would perform abortions. They began to restrict their interns and residents from providing abortion services. Some hospitals and some physicians stopped doing abortions because here was this doctor in Boston who did what appears to be a perfectly legal procedure, and he was indicted for manslaughter. The other thing that happened because of the national press and the notoriety is that people began to send in contributions to the Kenneth Edelin Defense Fund. From all over the country, envelopes would come in, Kenneth Edelin Defense Fund, Boston, Massachusetts, and somehow they found their way to us. There were crumpled dollar bills and $5 bills and an occasional check and sometimes quarters scotch taped to pieces of paper and put in the envelopes from people from all over this country. But what was also very important that came in the envelopes were stories. Often the stories started out by saying, this is dedicated to my mother or sister or cousin, next door neighbor, aunt, friend, who had had experiences with abortions prior to Roe. They were experiences such like the woman who wrote to me talking and describing her abortion experiences. Being told to go to a certain street corner at midnight, alone, and a car coming up, and being told to get into the back seat of the car, and being blindfolded, and taken to an abandoned building someplace, where there was a table covered in newspaper with a bare light bulb, and with the abortion procedure being carried out without anesthesia, without appropriate antiseptic technique. There were women who described being brutally raped as a part of the abortion procedure and the price they had to pay. And the stories that I got in these envelopes really put together for me a collage, a quilt, if you will, of what life was like for women in America prior to Roe. It was an awful picture. But the stories and the contributions, then the outpouring of support that I got from all across this country, from not only women who had experienced the horrors of illegal abortion, but from physicians, from philosophers, anthropologists, scientists, people who had been studying and fighting for legal abortion in this country for decades. And what this helped me to understand, it took a while, was that this was more than just about me. I mean, I had been indicted for manslaughter. I was brought up to be a good citizen. It was hard for me to think outside of myself. The horror of my career being gone, the horror of the potential of spending 20 years in jail, made it difficult for me to see outside of myself until I began to get the letters and until the outpouring of support from all over this country. And then I understood that this was about more than just Ken Edelin. This was about women being able to make decisions for themselves and physicians being able to carry out legal procedures that their patients had asked for. After a week's suspension and after demonstrations by hospital personnel, my colleagues, interns and residents and nurses and patients of mine and orderlies and elevator operators and protests and petitions being signed, I was reinstated to my residency training program, and I was able to complete my residency that June, 3 months after my indictment. In January of 1975, we went to trial in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. The prosecuting attorneys were Newman Flanagan, Joe Mulligan, James Brennan, and Charlie Dunn. The presiding judge was Judge James McGuire. We picked a jury of 16 people from Suffolk County, 4 of whom would be deselected at the end of the trial as alternate jurors. Of the 16 people, all were white. 13 were men, and 13 were Roman Catholic. Newman Flanagan, the prosecuting assistant district attorney, maintained the whole time that this was not a case against abortion. This is a case of manslaughter. But every expert witness he called, every expert witness who came from across this country to testify against me on behalf of the prosecution, was a member of some right-to-life organization, either in their own city, their own state, or held national office in some national right-to-life organization. We presented expert witnesses too, experts from all over this country, those who had written the textbooks, those who had been chairs of departments, those who had done the research in obstetrics and gynecology, came to Boston at their own expense to testify on my behalf because they understood that this was more than just about Ken Edelin. This was about every physician who wanted to carry out legal procedures for his or her patients. So we presented in this arena of a courtroom all of this scientific evidence. And at the end of the 6-week trial, before a jury of my peers, none of whom had attended college, after hearing all of this complicated scientific information and data, the jury of my peers found me guilty of manslaughter. It was devastating, obviously. It was devastating. I then had to go out on the lecture circuit again to raise money, not only to finish paying off the expenses of the trial, but also because we had to appeal the case, which we did. And I had to raise money to do that. But now I could talk about the case. And we appealed to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, and in December, on December 17th, 1976, the SJC of Massachusetts did two very significant things. Number one, they reversed the jury's verdict. And number two, in a very unusual move, I am told, they entered their own verdict of not guilty, which prevented Newman Flanagan, Joe Mulligan, Charlie Dunn, and James Brennan from coming back after me again. It was over. Throughout the trial, I received tremendous support from people all over this country, tremendous support from people outside of this country, tremendous support from all segments and sectors of the population. Sometimes during the trial, I was called awful names: baby killer, monster. But I made a determination, sitting in that courtroom for those 6 weeks, facing those 4 men and the jury of my peers, that I was going not to be quiet anymore, but I was going to speak out. I was prepared after my residency to go to Atlanta, Georgia. And I was going to be an obstetrician gynecologist there. I had received an offer from a group practice. And I was going to be an obstetrician gynecologist there and in private practice and do OB/GYN and, yes, provide abortion services. But the trial, the indictment and the trial changed all of that. And I made a determination then that they gave me a platform. And they really did not know that monster that they had created. And that I would use the platform of the notoriety of the trial to speak out against them and what they were trying to do to American women. That I would use the platform that I had been given to speak out so that physicians could carry out legal procedures for their patients. And years later, when I became chairman of the board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, that gave me an additional platform. And I used that platform to speak out against them as well. And finally, I've written my book. Took me 30 years. Took me 30 years. It was very painful to sit down to try and write this book. It was very painful to go through the transcript, not only to read it and to remember those days, but also to try to put it into a form that would be readable. Transcripts are generally pretty dull and uninteresting. And this now has given me another platform to speak out. People say, why'd you wait 30 years? It was difficult to do. I tried right after the trial, wrote and put it away, and for years didn't go back to it, and then picked it up again and wrote some more, and then put it away, and for years couldn't go back to it again, and even bought a cabin on a lake in Maine because I thought that's what writers should do. I'd sit there at the table in front of the window with my word processor and try to write and look out at the lake, and I try to write and I look back out at the lake and look back out at the lake and said, shut down the word processor and go swimming or boating or fishing on the lake with my kids. But it's now done. People have said to me, Ken, this is an old story, there's no interest, it's too old. I think not. I think it is the right time. This is the political season. We have been in this presidential race now for months. And we are going to have to make some very important and critical decisions about who will be president of this country come November of 2008 and who will go to the Congress. The Congress who, in 2003, your Congress, your members of the House of Representatives and my members of the Senate, all of us, they belong to us, passed a law which outlawed a specific kind of abortion procedure, very specific. And it was signed by our president, George W. Bush. And I will tell you as an obstetrician gynecologist that the procedure that they outlawed could be and would be and is for some women in certain circumstances, certain medical conditions, the best and safest procedure for her, and they have outlawed it. They said, doctor, you can't do that. We will put you in jail. And our Supreme Court, now headed by Justice Roberts, upheld that decision just last April in 2007. And said, yeah, it's okay. You can't do that anymore, doc. So in a decision written by Justice Kennedy, signed on to by Justice Roberts and Alito, and with a concurring opinion signed on to by Justice Scalia and written by Justice Thomas, I'm sorry. I can do that and you can't. Scalia and Thomas have said they want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. It was a 5-4 decision upholding the so-called PBA ban. In the dissent, written by Justice Ginsburg, the only person on the Supreme Court who knows what being pregnant is like, she has taken the argument in favor of Roe v. Wade and for women to have legal abortion in this country and access to quality reproductive health care and contraception to a different level. She said, we have moved beyond just the right to privacy. Being able to control their reproductive lives is essential for the dignity of American women, in fact, women all over this world. Being able to control their reproduction is important for the dignity and the autonomy, for the personhood, and for the citizenship, and for women to be able to enjoy the full fruits of the promise of our Constitution in America. So we're really at a crossroads. We've got a Supreme Court that has opened the door, that said it is okay to outlaw specific abortion procedures, and they have invited, I believe, as I read that decision, other challenges and further restrictions on specific abortion procedures in this country. The door is open. They have thrown it open. And our job is to stand in the doorway to protect the lives of American women. From the Congress, from state legislatures. And that's our responsibility. The stakes are too high, and we've got lots of other problems. We've got the war in Iraq. We've got this economy which is going to hell in a handbasket. We've got the mortgage crisis. We've got all of those things. But we also have the fundamental basic tenets of what this country is all about. The essence of our Constitution. The essence of full citizenship. The essence of equal opportunity for all of us. And that's what's at stake. If we win the war but lose our rights in this country, then what have we won? So it's up to each one of us to try and make a difference, to be involved in the political process so that we don't go back to the days prior to Roe. I would like to conclude by reading one further passage from my book. I've been criticized for reading this passage. People have said Ken is too rough. It's hard for people to hear. It's upsetting. I said, well, if I can't read it, then I shouldn't have written it. It's from the prologue. Spring 1966. Edelin, come on down. I need some help with the patient in the ER. It was 3 a.m. in my third week on the OBGYN service as a third-year medical student, and the resident covering the emergency room of Hubbard Hospital in Nashville was calling me for help. The adrenaline of anticipation sharpened my senses as I ran down the stairs, silently reviewing everything I had learned just in case. The ER was busy, gunshot wounds, car accidents, broken limbs, colds and rashes. But over in the corner of the wide open room was a young girl lying on a stretcher, immobile, with a dark mahogany red glow to her skin. The resident doctor covering the ER was on the phone nearby. A nurse broke away from tending to another patient and hung a bottle of IV fluids on a pole near the girl's bed. Another came over and put a blood pressure cuff on her arm. I think it's a septic AB, the resident said into the phone as I got near enough to hear him. Putting his hand over the mouth of the phone, he looked up at me, nodded his head toward the girl on the stretcher. Start an IV and get some bloods for a type and cross match, 6 units and a CBC. He then returned to his conversation over the phone. The girl on the stretcher was young, maybe 17 or so, and her reddish-black skin sharply contrasted with the white of the crumpled sheet, barely covering her body. Her face and body were swollen, her skin tight and glistening. Her fingers, toes, and the tip of her nose were a dusky bluish-purple color, and there was a growing splotch of dark red ooze on the sheets gathered between her legs. Except for her shallow breathing, she lay there motionless. As a third-year medical student, I was good at starting IVs. I put a tourniquet on her arm, got the necessary equipment, then swabbed her arm with alcohol and inserted a needle into the largest vein I could find. She twitched ever so slightly. Good. She could still feel pain of the needle. Her brain had not completely shut down. By this time, my own brain, heart, and all my senses were racing in overtime. This is why I wanted to be a doctor, to change lives, to save lives. And she was still alive. Her breathing, although weak, and her response to pain meant that we and she still had a chance. I drew blood for the test and connected the plastic tubing to the hub of the needle, watching the saline solution run into her body. She was hot to the touch. I struggled to secure the needle to her skin with adhesive tape. BP is 60 over palp, one of the nurses called out. Pulse 140, temp 105. 5 minutes? Thanks, Dr. Treherne. The resident hung up the phone and joined me over by the stretcher. Treherne is on his way down. Dr. Treherne, one of the busiest OBGYNs in Nashville, was in the hospital with a patient in labor. He arrived at the ER in no time. As he walked to the stretcher, the crowd that had gathered parted to let him through. As the resident began to describe what he had learned from his exam, Treherne felt the heat of the patient's skin against his hands. His jaw tightened into a frown and his eyes became more focused. He gently pulled down the lower lids of her eyes with his thumb and looked into them. He then put his hands on her distended abdomen and pressed down to examine her himself. She did not react. Sorrow washed over me. Her reaction to pain had changed just that fast. "Glove," said Treherne. The nurse handed him one. He gently inserted 2 fingers into the young girl's vagina and pressed down on her lower abdomen. He closed his eyes, directing all of his senses to the tips of his fingers. After feeling her internal organs, he withdrew his fingers. The rubber glove was covered in a milky red pus. He sniffed it. "Clostridia," he said. In the days before sophisticated technology, we used all of our senses to make a diagnosis. She was infected with one of the most lethal bacteria, Clostridium perfringens, likely the result of a poorly performed illegal abortion. She was septic, and she might die. "Let's get her to the OR," Dr. Treherne said. We all knew that the only hope of saving her would be to remove the nidus of infection, her pregnant uterus. "Is her family here?" "No," one of the nurses responded sadly. "She was left at the entrance to the ER." She paused for a moment, then continued, "I've already called in the OR crew. I've cross-matched her for 6 units of blood," the resident reported. "There's some O negative in the blood bank we could use if we need it." "I'll meet you there," Dr. Treherne said to the resident. "I have to check on my patient in labor." The resident turned to me. "Edelin," he said, "write up a history and physical, check on her lab results, get her clothes, and help the nurses to get her to the OR. I've got to see some other patients down here." I sat on the stool next to this young girl's stretcher and briefly wrote what I had heard and seen. I glanced up at her a few times, feeling immense pity. She was alone. She had no family or friends in the waiting room, no one to answer the inevitable questions about when, where, and by whom the abortion had been performed. I loved the excitement of being a doctor, having the ability to save lives, but I loathed death, especially witnessing the death of someone so young, and I realized she probably would die. Time was working against us. In less than 5 minutes, I wheeled her to the elevator and brought her to the OR where Dr. Treherne was waiting. The OR crew was just finishing their setup of the room. Treherne came over, looked the young girl over once more, and began wheeling her motionless body to the OR. We lifted her to the table, and after checking her vital signs, the anesthesiologist put her to sleep. The resident, Dr. Treherne, and I left the scrub. By the time we entered the OR, the girl was already asleep. Her abdomen had been prepped and draped. Dr. Treherne was ready to go. "Scalpel." As he made the incision in the girl's abdomen, fluid oozed from her tissues. He opened the abdominal cavity, revealing thick, dusky pus that bathed all of her organs like pea soup. The foulest of odors seeped into the room. Treherne hurled her enlarged uterus gently in his hands. Like her fingers and toes, it too had a bluish discoloration. "Mush," he said as he held her womb in his hands. The backside of her uterus was a gaping hole, and floating free in her abdomen on top of loops of slime-covered intestines was a red rubber catheter, like a large worm slithering through the coils of her guts. "I thought so," he said quietly. To no one in particular, he continued. "A couple of days ago, someone probably stretched the catheter on a knitting needle or a coat hanger and put it into her womb to abort her. But they punctured the back wall of it, and the catheter ended up in her abdomen. It smells like Clostridium." The pungent odor came through my cloth mask, made its way into my nose, and burned itself into my memory. The lethal bacteria had infected her womb, oozing into her abdomen and spreading throughout her body in a matter of days. She was septic. Her body, blood, and all of her organs were infected. Dr. Treherne removed the source of the infection, her uterus and the dead fetus it contained. It was the only thing he could do. Using liters of sterile water, he rinsed as much of the pus out of her abdomen as he could, then increased the dose of the antibiotic that the resident had already ordered for the patient. Treherne was in an uphill struggle against death. The memory of this young girl has stayed with me. Her motionless body, the discoloration of her skin and fingers, the foul smell of the pus which infected her body, and the heroic courage of Dr. Treherne are imprinted on my brain. The final image I saw from the door of the recovery room has replayed in my mind again and again. With tubes and drains emerging from every opening of her body, she lay in bed with Dr. Treherne at her side, holding her hand. It was the only thing left for him to do as life slipped away and she died. That's why we have to protect American women. We can never, ever go back to the days before Roe. Thank you all for coming this evening.
It's the custom here to have questions. It seems to me probably not entirely appropriate, but I did say we'd pass out cards. And if you have something you'd like Dr. Edelin to respond to, and you raise your hand, someone will come get the card, and we have time for a couple of those. If no one, after hearing Ken's testimonial and prayer, has anything to complain about or argue with, that's fine with me. But if you have something, raise your hand now.
While he's getting your card, I'm going to make my classmate angry at me. I'm going to call on the gentleman in the blue shirt. Yes, sir, you have a question? Okay.
See?
See? Okay.
Done. Okay. First question is, were the lawyers and the DA involved in your case ever held accountable for the actions against you once your case was overturned?
No. Newman Flanagan went on to become the head of the National District Attorneys Association. He then headed up their foundation. But the question brings another interesting aspect of this story to light, and that is what we call wrongful prosecutions and wrongful convictions. Just today, there was a man released after 10 years in jail for rape because of the modern technology of DNA analysis. He was released because his DNA did not match the DNA that was found on the victim. After 10 years. There have been over 200 cases that have been reversed because of the modern technology of DNA. So wrongful prosecutions and wrongful persecutions and wrongful convictions are certainly not unusual or unique in this country. And if you don't believe that, all you have to do is think of the Duke lacrosse players and how they were wrongfully charged by a prosecutor who had a political motive for his own reelection. So no, Newman Flanagan, Joe Mulligan, Charlie Dunn, and James Brennan were never held accountable. Not yet, anyway.
The next question I pick out of this is, you had mentioned the Kennedy family in your opening statements. Do you know, are you aware of Senator Edward Kennedy's opinion on your trial and on Roe v. Wade?
Yes. Senator Kennedy has been an ardent supporter of a woman's right to choose. He's been a close personal, well, not a close personal friend, but he certainly has been a friend for many years, and in fact, received the Kenneth C. Edelin Award from Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. So he's a very strong supporter of a woman's right to choose.
Now, I have rules, but then there's Alan. So Alan would like to say something. I'll give him the mic.
Thank you for breaking the rules. In 1973, when you were going through that, I was working in Thailand. So I was not involved, but we both went to Planned Parenthood. I believe I was chair of the board before you were. But I have to congratulate you, as besides from this, of all the chairs of Planned Parenthood, you were the most powerful public speaker, and I congratulate you on your record, as well as this great book. And so I think it's terrific you've been here, so thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Alan preceded me by several chairs, I think, as the chair of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. He, a couple of years ago, received the Margaret Sanger Award from Planned Parenthood, which is their highest award. In all modesty, I have to tell you that I'm getting the Margaret Sanger Award this year in March from Planned Parenthood Federation of America. It is their highest award. But what's also significant about that is that the first two recipients of the Margaret Sanger Award back in 1966 were President Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King, whose birthday or whose day we celebrated yesterday. And people frequently ask me about the confluence of civil rights and reproductive rights, and there's always been a confluence of those, because if you control the body of one group of people and make them work in the fields, or you control the body of another group of people and tell them how many children they can have and when they can have those children and by whom they can have those children, both for me are forms of slavery. One group controlling the bodies of another. And our history in this country is full of stories and evidence and anecdotes of people who were abolitionists working with people who were suffragettes to not only end slavery but also give women the right to vote.
I think Ken's actually answered two of the other cards, and it's gotten on, and I'm going to impose on anyone who I didn't read the card from to just stick around. Perhaps Ken will give a couple of minutes. I will read the last card I'm going to read. It says, "No question, only a statement. Your courage, Dr. Edelin, is to be admired and envied." And I agree with that. Thanks, Ken.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for this.